And today I will continue with a talk which I started last Thursday on the subject of the value of generosity. And to give a little bit of context, I'm working my way through a series of practices and values which are found in a particular place in the scriptures in Buddhism, known as the Mangala Sutta, or the 38 Blessings of Life, which are almost like a staircase of sequential practices or values, where the idea is that if you start off on any one of those values, then it will lead to the next more sophisticated one, eventually all the way towards transcendental sort of values and virtues. And the place we are so far, number 15 on our staircase, is a place in the Mangala Sutta, which is to do with becoming a pillar of society. And the idea is that this is the sort of teachings which will be meaningful to people who have already fairly much got their life in order, have no more worries about earning their living or looking after their families, and they are in a position to start to give something back to society. It's not the ultimate of values and virtues in Buddhism, but it is a place where you start to be able to express your ability to give something back or to make a change in the world. And what I talked about last time is that generosity in Buddhism, ironically, is seen in a rather strange way, which is not necessarily in terms of the changes which you bring about through your actions to the people who receive your generosity, but rather the other way around, which is how by helping other people you transform something within yourself as a result. So most of the things I'm talking about are not so much what is the most effective way to practice generosity for the person on the receiving end, but rather what is the most effective way to really transform the quality of your own mind through your generosity. So it's a little bit back to front, depending on how you have understood generosity from the past. But where I'm at so far with this is to say that effective generosity for transforming the quality of your mind has 4 qualities. Firstly, the thing which you choose to share with another person ought to be something which is pure. So it's going to be something that is going to bring about true or long-term benefit for that person. It doesn't necessarily need to be something material or a physical gift. It could be knowledge, it could be forgiveness, but it needs to be something given out of purity. The intention behind the giving ought also to be pure, which means that it should be given out of compassion, wholeheartedness, willingness, and it ought to inspire joy in the mind of the giver, both before, during, and after the making over of that gift. Thirdly, you as the giver should be fairly pure, which means that you ought to be a person who has established yourself in your own integrity. So you ought to be a person who is not sort of cheating other people by what you're doing. And lastly, the person who receives a gift ought to be someone who is somehow worthy of what you are giving with them. Last time I talked about some people who are put off generosity by, let's say, helping a beggar on the street who is asking for money for a cup of tea, and later you catch them drinking whiskey which they bought with the money, and you feel somehow that generosity wasn't worth the effort, and it puts you off the whole sort of idea of generosity. So by being slightly more selective about who you single out for your generosity, then it's said that that keeps up your relationship with being generous on a more healthy level. So on this idea of worthy recipients, Buddhism has quite a lot to say. And the idea is that the purer the person who receives the gift, the more it seems to magnify or multiply the sort of positive energy arising from that act of generosity. So, actually, even giving something to a hungry animal will give a lot of benefit to you, the giver. It's said that the qualities that come back to a giver, this is from the Buddhist scriptures, are long life, good complexion, happiness, strength, and intelligence for no less than 100 lifetimes from helping a hungry animal once. Surprised? And by the same token, if it's not an animal, but it's a person who you're helping, even if that person doesn't keep the precepts, or the 5 precepts, then the gift will bring the same fruits for 1,000 lifetimes. Impressed yet? So even you're drunk on the corner, masquerading as a tea drinker, still get 1,000 lifetimes worth. However, if that person does keep the precepts, an ordinary person, then it would be multiplied by 100, so 100,000 lifetimes. And if that person is not just an ordinary person, but someone who is a sort of spiritual person with a spiritual vocation, even if it's a hermit or an ascetic of some sort, then it will multiply that again to be 1 trillion lifetimes. So that's to the power of 12, 10 to the power of 12. And if it happens to be a person who is practicing for, or who has already attained some level of sainthood, which means stream entry, once returner, non-returner, or an enlightened person, then the merit yielded is even more, so more than 1 trillion lifetimes worth. And it goes on. That includes the Buddha just now as well. And if you are to support not just one person, but the whole community of those who are practicing spirituality on that sort of level, then it is more still. So that is what is meant by a pure recipient on different sorts of levels. Within Buddhism, it's seen as somehow a person's duty to give support to the community of clergy in such a way, because according to the Sigalovada Sutta, which you have heard quite a lot from already, the sutta about the 6 directions or 6 social groups from which we good habits brush off on us from those who are close to us in the community, the way in which a congregation member should interact fruitfully with the monastic community is to do 5 things, which is to act kindly towards them, speak kindly towards them, and think kindly towards them, but also to keep an open house to them and supply the basic needs that they have for subsisting in their lives. So this is the origin of a sort of idea of symbiosis between the monastic community who give teachings but lead a simple and easy to maintain life, give teachings towards the lay community, and the lay community helping the monks out with the simple basic needs in order to facilitate being taught more easily by those monastic community. So, as I said, all of this sort of insinuates that a person who is able to be generous has a certain level of financial security for themselves. And I think you heard a talk recently from another monk with lots of pictures of Lamborghinis and stuff. No? Maybe you missed that one. Yeah, I don't have any pictures of Lamborghinis, I'm really sorry. But I do have a picture of something called the Millionaire's Heart, which shows that generosity isn't the whole picture, but you need to put it in context. And the financial security on which generosity comes naturally or willingly or easily does depend on a person having been fairly diligent to acquire that wealth already, that they also look after it fairly carefully and don't let it be frittered away on things which are unimportant. Thirdly, living within their means, and I suppose being generous within means as well, and also having the sort of friends that aren't going to encourage them to be wasteful. Yeah? And in some religions, they talk about budgeting to allow yourself to be more generous. For example, in Islam, they have something called zakat, where they actually put a percentage on it. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's something like 2.5%. Well, in Buddhism, they have pie charts. I'm not sure if they had it 2,000 years ago, but they do now, okay? And the idea is not to say dividing something by 5 makes 20%, but they say that if you're thinking about what you have available to you in terms of income, disposable income, as it were, then you should divide that in 5 to cover all the things which you can use your income for in a way that will produce benefit in your life and others. So we'll look at those. Large enough to read? Okay. So I'm not saying 20% each, but all of these things ought to be represented in the ideal world. So on a day-to-day basis, you might, your main concern would be with working capital, so the money used on a day-to-day basis. And they do actually put a figure on that of 25% for your immediate needs, 25% for business emergencies, and then the other half for reinvestment in your business. So if you're self-employed, that would make sense immediately. Next comes what you put aside for domestic emergencies, so not the business emergencies. You might say, well, we've got the National Health Service for that, but not every country does. But that would be the sort of thing you might want to put things on one side for, things which you can't predict. Then there comes generosity towards friends. You might think it's just the poor and needy who you might want to help, but in fact, even to keep up friendships, sometimes you need to have some slack in your assets. Even if it's something as simple as having a spare room to put people up in when they come to visit, that would be considered as generosity. Any hospitality would be on that sort of little yellow segment there. And then comes what are known euphemistically as tributes. And you may be interested to know that that extends to generosity towards your extended family, hospitality, remembering deceased members of your family, such as funerals or memorial events. Taxes are in there. It may come to slightly more than 20% in many places. And then there's support for what's known as customary religion, which you might think of as any good causes which are seen as, which are regarded as important in wherever you're living. And then the final one comes for support for the meditation infrastructure or monastic community in your area. So that would be the Buddhist way of looking at things. Degrees of generosity. In Buddhism, they tend to go to great lengths with generosity. It was seen as something very important in the Buddha's own track record of cultivating good deeds to reach over the course of many lifetimes towards becoming a Buddha. Last time, for those who followed on, we had him lying in the mud to act as a human bridge for the Buddha to walk over, even though he had mental power that could very easily have mended the road in a particular lifetime. He did regard generosity as something very important to practice. And the sort of levels of generosity which are talked about over the course of many lifetimes were, starting off on the most basic level, it would be sharing things with others which are excess to our needs. So we have a plate of food, more than we can eat. A hungry friend happens to come along, we might cut that in two and share that plate of food with our friend. Excess to our needs. Beyond that would be what's known as generosity on the level of self-sacrifice, which would mean if our friend comes along and they haven't eaten anything for 3 days, we might give the whole plate to our friend, even though we are rather hungry ourselves. That would be what would be meant by self-sacrifice rather than merely sort of generosity. Yeah? You can sort of relate to that on a certain level. But it is said that over the course of cultivating many, in many lifetimes, sometimes the Buddha went further than that, and he actually gave of himself for the benefit of others who needed something more than he did. I guess in the present day that would mean something like giving up a kidney for a relative whose life is on the line. Yeah? Or even something as simple as donating blood. You're actually giving of yourself, even though you could do with the blood, but you're giving it for someone who needs it more than you. So that is giving of yourself. These days, blood transfusions are not that sort of scary anymore. But it's said that sometimes the Buddha would even put his own life on the line for another person's benefit. So that would be the sort of seen as the ultimate sacrifice, if you're prepared to do that. Some people say, well, I've been generous here and there in my life, and I didn't win the lottery yet. Did I do something wrong? It's like the karma not kicked in yet? Or is it like, am I just like gullible? Well, in Buddhism, apparently there is a set of factors to do with generosity, which say that if you have any of these factors, then it tends to speed the outcomes. For example, if you give with a very high level of faith, then it tends to speed the outcome. If you give out of a sense of respect, rather than just looking down on a person and saying, oh, you're a charity case, the results tend to come to you more quickly. Giving at the appropriate time or at an allotted time, which is maybe makes it a little bit more difficult, is said to bring the fruits back to you again in a more timely fashion. Also, giving with thought to help the recipient, and giving in a way that doesn't come into conflict with your own sort of, let's say, your pie chart, or bring you into conflict with others, tends to make the outcomes come back more quickly. Are you ready for a story? Sometimes people tend to associate being generous with being rich. But there's a story from the Buddhist scriptures about a man who was extremely poor, who still managed to be generous. And you might say that it's even more meaningful for a poor person to be able to share something or give something away than it is for a rich person. And as a result of his generosity, then a lot of transformations happened in his life very quickly, because he had the faith and the respect and all the other things I just mentioned. So the story of this guy is that he was so poor. In fact, he and his wife were so poor that although they both had a waistcloth each, but they had only one shirt between them. They didn't wear shirts in India, they wore that sort of thing which you wear over your shoulder. Yeah? So they were so poor that they could never go out of the house together, because either one of them had to wear the shirt or the other one did when they left the house. The other person had to stay at home in order to remain decent. Yeah? So one day the husband went out of the house and he went to hear a teaching from the Buddha at the local temple, like you do. And the Buddha happened to be talking about the benefits of generosity, and all the sort of rich people saying, yeah, generosity, we know all about that. And he was listening very carefully, and he thought, wow, I'm so poor, and really if generosity has all these wonderful fruits about making a person's life easier and providing abundance in their life and all that sort of thing, this should be exactly the thing which I ought to be doing. But all I have to give is like the shirt off my back, as it were. And if I give the shirt off my back, then what's the wife going to say? Is she going to be eternally condemned and never coming out of the house ever again? But he was filled with faith, and at a certain stage, and this was one of these talks by the Buddha where the Buddha was going to go on all night, because in India it's like nighttime is a good time to give a talk because it's not so hot and the moon is out and whatever. So in the first watch of the night, so it's probably about 10 p.m. or whatever, he decided, I want to really give this cloth from my shoulder, offer it to the Buddha in order to cultivate generosity. But he thought of his wife and what the wife might say, and he decided against it, but continued to listen to the talk. So the Buddha went on for another 4 hours or whatever, talking about generosity and how great it is and all the transformations it could bring in one's life. So reached about 2 a.m. in the morning, and again he thought, I would really like to give my shirt to the Buddha. It's the only thing I have to give, and I'm not sure if I really care about what my wife says anymore. And then he thought of his wife's face and he got scared again. So the Buddha continued to give the talk until eventually the sun came up, about 6 a.m. in the morning. And eventually he overcome his reluctance to be a generous person and managed to make over his shawl to the Buddha. At which point he exclaimed the words, "Citta me," because he written there. It's Pali language. But what it actually means is, I've conquered it, I've conquered it. Which may sound a bit of a strange thing to say. But there happened to be a very rich king also in the audience called King Pathanati. And generally, if you're a king and anyone says, I've conquered it, anywhere near you, you get a little bit sort of restless. So the king made an inquiry. Who's this person shouting, I've conquered it in my midst? Can't be a good thing. Generally, anyone says they've conquered something and you, in your kingdom, then you chop their head off, right? So he made some inquiries, and it turned out that it was a very poor man who had overcome his reluctance to be generous in order to give this last possession of his to the Buddha in order to cultivate generosity. And the king was so impressed, thinking, look, I'm a king and I've got all the riches at my disposal and still I'm not that generous. And here's the guy who's given everything he has basically to the Buddha. This man should be rewarded. So the Buddha gave a whole lot of riches to reward the man for doing such a brave and noble thing. But immediately the man got all these gifts from the king. He was on a run. He gave them all to the Buddha and just kept one shawl for himself and one shawl for his wife. At which point the king was even more impressed with the man's generosity and gave him a whole bunch of things which he would this time be able to keep. And end of the story was the man made his way home with his newfound wealth to his wife. But the Buddha gave an aside to the rest of the members of the monastic community who were there, saying that if he had decided to give that shawl at 10 p.m., like when he first, the thought entered his mind to do that act of generosity, he would have been made 4 times as rich by the king. If he had given it at 2 a.m. in the morning, when the second time it occurred to him to be generous, he would have been made twice as rich. But because he hesitated, it somehow blunted the purity of intention which he had to make the gift. And so he was only left with like a reasonable amount of wealth and riches given to him by the king. So this is to do with how even the same act of generosity can be transformed for the better or for the worse simply by the strength of the intention of the person who is the giver. This is the sort of Buddhist logic of looking at generosity. So in conclusion for today, the practicality of being generous is that if you're giving something, then it should be things that you have earned in an honest way, not the daffodils which you pulled up in the local park. Secondly, you should give something that is appreciated, truly helpful to that person. It also should be given, you should give a thing that wouldn't be used in an unintended way. If you're giving something, don't give in ways that will cause you or others regret later. And before you give something, then you should work on your quality of mind beforehand. So if there's a particular act of generosity you've been thinking about doing for some time, and maybe sit down to meditate first before you go ahead to do that generosity. Don't give generosity even to those whose status is worse off than yourself, by looking at them as pathetic or charity cases, because that somehow reduces the power of the generosity which arises as a result of your gift. And bear in mind that the people who you share with might equally be people on a similar status as yourself, your friends, or it might be someone of a more elevated status who you want to give something to out of a gesture of respect or gratitude And lastly, yes, giving out of respect for someone may be a valid reason in order to give a gift of some sort to a person. So I'll finish off with a few little announcements. For those who enjoy meditation today, I would encourage you to meditate further at home. If you can, 20 minutes a day is a good length of time to start with. If you can cultivate meditation on a regular basis, then it will have a cumulative effect and it will become easier for you to see progress in your meditation. Sometimes we meditate on our own and we start out fine, but after about 7 days we get a little bit more reluctant to meditate, like the inspiration wears off, or we forget how to meditate, in which case you may find the app, which you can download for free onto your mobile phone, called MindGem, might be a good way to keep up your practice and keep it regular, and to keep yourself informed about different ways to do the meditation practice at the center of the body. Here we have classes every Tuesday and Thursday. Generally, the meditation on the Tuesday night is a little bit shorter, designed for beginners. On Thursdays, it's about 45 minutes. Also, every Saturday, we still have the online meditation where you can meditate from the comfort of your home between 7 and 8 p.m. on British time using Zoom, and the details are there. Also, on the Tuesday the 14th, we have coming up a full moon event, which coincides with the usual Tuesday class, where we do a little bit of candle lighting along with our meditation on the theme of whatever the strawberry moon holds on that day, probably the equinox or something, solstice, sorry. And last but not least, we have a meditation down Somerset Way coming up between the 8th and 10th of June, which you might be interested to look into. Normally we hold our meditation retreats here, but for a little bit of a change of scene this time, we have gone to the trouble to find out a retreat center to give a little bit of country ambience for our meditation for the weekend time. So you might want to look up themeditationsurrey.com if you're interested to look at that. I think there are still early bird rates going.